Good morning, everybody. I hope you can see my first slide. It's a beautiful morning outside. So Dan and I and everyone involved are very grateful to you for spending some time with us inside and looking at this PowerPoint presentation. Over the last 20 years, we've learned quite a lot about the lighthouse. That's thanks to many other researchers working with myself. That includes Dan DeLong, our host for today, and the memories shared with us from a lot of folks who live immediately in the area, and a few of whom actually work there. So we are grateful to them and for all the stories they've shared. Much of that has now been vested in a series of panels and brochures. And of course, a lot of those are now in the lighthouse, which is all locked up and we can't go there. So we're going to try this other tack today. I've not done a webinar before, but Dan's been leading me through, and I think this is going to work. I want to focus on one story in particular. It's the one Dan has alluded to, and that is why it is we moved the Cape Jourimain Lighthouse. It may be fairly obvious to you why we moved it, but I want to share some visuals with you to give you a sense of how that goes. To begin with, we did move the lighthouse. It was transferred to us with the property it stands on back in 2015. And by 2016, as you can see in this image, we had established a new concrete foundation while the lighthouse was still standing back there in its original place. So we contracted with Merville Rushton to move it from back there to up here. The first thing Merville and his crew did was move the lighthouse onto their own rig, which has wheels under it. That was quite an operation in itself. Then they hooked on a tractor and pulled it forward, at least as far as they could. Eventually, the tractor was going to get in the way of our new concrete foundation, so they brought in this other rig to help us along. It pulled it further towards the new foundation, and eventually it settled directly on top. Once the lighthouse had been relocated and fastened down, we immediately began some restoration work. That lasted all through the winter and into the next spring. Much of that work is thanks to Shane and his crew at Cape Bear Construction. We're very grateful to them. They did a fine job. But instead of lingering on that set of changes, I wanted to address this question of why was it moved and where did it used to stand? So I'm starting with this image, which I've taken from Google Earth, and it shows the lighthouse in its new location and the faint reference to where it used to stand. Notice at the bottom here that the satellite imagery they're using here dates to 2020. So this is actually quite recent. I'm next going to show you another image that I take from Service New Brunswick's very special website called GONB. It also has satellite images, but this is an older satellite image that actually shows the lighthouse where it stood before we moved it. A little later on, I'm going to depend upon your noticing that the shadow from this particular image extends here to the right. So please bear that in mind. I'll also point out to you that these light gold lines in this picture are Service New Brunswick's way of letting us know where the property boundaries are. And I'm going to need to talk about property boundaries as well. The first thing I want to do through the magic of computerized handling of images is I'm going to take this image and lay it on top of the previous image. You can see here as it changes from green to a different green, I've actually laid one image on top of the other one, and then I can control the transparency of this image so you both see this image with the lighthouse in its shadow, and you see the new location of the lighthouse. You can see them both. Most particularly, you can see the new coastline and the old coastline. So let me show you the next picture. I'm just going to change the transparency here a bit to bring the other one a little more clearly to the fore. And I'll switch back and forth a little bit so you get some idea how much the coastline changed. It actually moved that much between one image and the other. And that was only 6 years, plus or minus. So in a relatively few years, the coastline has come right into the area where the lighthouse used to stand. And it's a good thing we moved it when we did. So I think you knew that it was erosion. Most of you will have known that it was erosion that motivated us to get this moved. But I just thought I'd show you this to emphasize how important that is, and indeed how important it has always been. So I'm going to go back to this other image from GONB with the property lines. This one notes that the Canadian Wildlife Service manages most of this land as a national wildlife area. And when we had property transferred to us, this strip was transferred to us. This parcel, it's about an acre, was transferred to us, onto which we've moved the lighthouse. And then another parcel, this original parcel, was transferred to us, but now follows the low water line. It used to be bigger than this. So this is where the lighthouse now stands as of 2016. This is where the lighthouse stood before that, going back to an earlier move in 1955. And the question is, where was that earlier lighthouse located? Can we find out anything about that? Let alone that there were two moves. So we have two locations to try to establish. So I'm going to turn to information. Oh, I guess the first thing I want to remind myself of is this abbreviated parcel we have here. There's hardly room here inside this for an earlier location. It must be that the lighthouse was located off here somewhere where erosion has taken it away. So that's been the challenge, and that's been the puzzle. How do we find out where that was? Well, my first effort was to see if I could find out something about what that parcel actually looked like when it was originally deeded to the federal government onto which they could build a lighthouse. And our deed transfer actually gives us that transcription. So I used that transcription and I used it on the GONB website. The nifty thing about the GONB website is it comes with a tool to let you draw these lines. It actually lets you draw them to measure. So I could draw this one exactly 209 feet. I could draw this one at 100 feet. Well, I was aiming for 100, even if it only came out 99.78, but pretty close. The other thing it allows you to do, it actually allows you to control the direction. So the compass setting for these lines was actually listed on our website. It would say slightly west of north, or it would say east of north, and I would be able to follow those for a prescribed distance. And if I lay that out on their satellite image, this shows us what that original deeded property actually looked like. It extended well out here into the water. And if there was land in this, that would have given them plenty of room originally to find the lighthouse. So I not only found out what the parcel used to look like, I also found out two other very useful things. One of them was to scale. I know what distances are. I know what 100 feet looks like. I know what directions look like. I can use compass directions. So with that in mind, I turn to another set of documents we have. When the lighthouse was moved, the old federal department would issue a bulletin to mariners and say, be wary because the Cape Jourimain Lighthouse has just been moved back, 116 feet in this direction. And in another one, it says it was relocated in this direction 115 feet. So using the GONB tools, I was able actually to start with our current location and confirm that sure enough, that's about the distance we moved it from there. Then I was able to find out that the previous move, pre-1955, took it out to there. And then while I was at it, I reached into the earlier documents and find out that the lighthouse had originally been out here somewhere. So that really got me started. That's the main piece of evidence I've used here, is this geometry of compass headings and distances, which the GONB tool site lets me work up. But we didn't stop there. It turns out there's other evidence. Some of that may be less obvious, but here's one of them. That's exactly the location in which we found stones, squared building stones. The government's documentation makes it quite clear they were quite proud that in 1955, for the first time, they mounted the lighthouse on a concrete base. And of course, that's what we've done as well. Our new foundation is concrete. But prior to these two locations, the lighthouse had always been set on traditional old sandstone building stones. And it turns out that if you go down to the beach, there's a remarkable collection of those building stones. They're not all there, but there are a lot of them there. We think the rest of them did not travel very far. They're just buried underneath the kind of detritus that tides and storms have moved around in this location. There are also some stones out in this direction, but they're not as many. They're more scattered. They don't give me as convincing a source of evidence. So I'm listing it here, but I'm not going to rely on it out there. Then we do have another source of information. It turns out that the government still has an aerial photograph. This is an early aerial that was taken back in the 1930s. This is fairly soon after the Jourimain Islands had their various farms purchased by the government and everybody was moved off. That is to say, everybody was moved off except the lighthouse down here and the Allen Hotel farm, which was held on to for a while because it served as a backlight. So if I zoom into this, you can see this area a little more clearly and the backlight. And I'm going to move in even closer to this area. So this dates to 1935, which means this is prior to the 1955 move. That must therefore be the location of the 1911 lighthouse. I say 1911 because that's when the previous move was made. So this is where it stood from 1911 to 55. And from this image alone, I cannot tell much about its current location because this, of course, shows the original island from 35 and its original coastline. And incidentally, it shows us a lot of earlier buildings. But in order to find out where that fits onto the current landscape, I have to play this same game again. I'm going to take this image, I'm going to adjust its scale and direction a little bit, rubber sheeting, as we say, and I'm going to lay that on top of those earlier images you've seen. So underneath, I still have the earlier image that has the lighthouse with its shadow going off to the right. And now laid on top of that, I have this image of the lighthouse with its shadow going straight up. It also shows a shed the government built and a keeper's house that they built for the lighthouse keeper. And the family who were the keepers, the Bents, had actually built some buildings of their own. I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. And that's just across the boundary line into land that the Bent family owned privately. You can see the roadway through here. The roadway ends up being a major landmark for me to fit these images one on top of the other, that and where we think the lighthouse is located. And there's some other clues in there that I've relied upon as well. But I was quite convinced that this helps to confirm that my earlier measurements that the previous lighthouse prior to 1955 sat out here right about where we found all those foundation stones. Another fact, I was going to say more importantly, but also important, is this image gives me a strong sense of where the original coastline was, what the coastline looked like, where low water looked like those years ago prior to that move. This was taken in 1935, so that's a good image of what the 1935 coastline looked like. So obviously it moved into here, and then it moved further into there, and I'll say a bit more about that in just a few minutes. So that takes care of our one move. Let me simplify the picture, which I have here. I've cleaned it up a bit. There's the location of the lighthouse in 2016, just in review. There's the lighthouse from 1955 until it was moved 4 years ago. This is the previous location to that. It was moved there, we think, in 1911 and lasted there for whatever that is, almost 44, 45 years. So the question is, can we confirm this earlier location? Then we would actually have all of the locations of the lighthouse. That would be pretty nifty. And we may even learn something about whether erosion has been the main motive driving this all the way through. Because it turns out that, happily, we have one other important source of information. When the government bought all of this land, it dug into its own files and it found an earlier site plan that had been drawn quite a number of years earlier. There's no date on this plan, at least when the overall plan was drawn. But if we look closely down in this area, I take it you can see the coastline here. You can see where the lighthouse was. You can see why they were worried. It was really close. But I'm going to zoom closer in this so you can get an even better sense. I should add, we think this map was actually drawn, this plan was drawn in 1905. The reason we think it was drawn in 1905 is here's an engineer. This is the resident engineer's office who's signed this thing in Nova Scotia, and it's dated to March of, if you can read that or not, believe it or not, that's 05. So this was actually drawn in 1905. And strikingly, there's all of this engineers focus on all of this framing and construction, which they were thinking about using to protect the coastline. If you look carefully down here, you can see the bottom of the tower that says tower. This is a cross section of what the coastline looked like in 1905. It turns out that, this section, it says section AB. So that's a section that runs from A here to off of my map in B. That's exactly what the profile right in that area looked like. It turns out that in 1890, we know this from federal documents, they had actually done some initial work on this coastline, had put in some cribbing, and over the course of 15 years, it had slipped away a lot of it, and the coastline had eroded in towards the lighthouse anyway. So one of the possibilities was to go back to that technique and increase the size of and the strength of all of this kind of cribbing using log and stone. There were several letters we found going back and forth saying, well, we've either got to do all this new cribbing or we got to move the lighthouse. Which is it going to be? Of course, this is the government. So instead of deciding in a few weeks or a few months, they decided in a few years. So between 1905 and 1910-11, they debated this issue, and they finally decided instead of putting the money into cribbing, they would move the lighthouse. We actually have the letters that say that. While I have this image on the screen, I might emphasize that this then is the location of the lighthouse where it was originally built in 1869. Another feature we have on this says road, and we know that the roadway was purchased by the government just a few years later. It may just have taken their lawyers that long to sort this out. The family that owned the island, the Allens, had sold them the patch for the lighthouse, and they'd sold them an additional amount for this roadway way back in the beginning, as early as 1872. You'll notice that there's a barn on this site. One of the things those letters talk about is the barn was in disrepair. Should we move it too, or should we just let the barn go? So I'll say a word more about that when we take the next step. I'm going to use this same image. I have to prep the image in order to use it as a transparency over all the stuff we have before. So there's my preparatory work. I have to change the direction of it to north, and I have to improve the scale of it. I can do that by keeping all of the relative measurements in this intact. So, because that's where the information really comes from. So now I'm going to lay this on top of the increasing number of layers we have. So this has GONB's image underneath. It has the 1935 image underneath. You can see both the shadow from the earlier image. You can see the up-pointing image of the 1935 image. And now in lighter color, you can see this earlier 1905 image. It's a lot of images to keep in mind, and this is becoming a quite confusing palimpsest of images built up on top of each other, but it turns out to be extraordinarily informative. I should probably admit this is not an entirely precise process. I don't think we can actually locate the lighthouse to within a foot or two, but we certainly get into a quite convincing story that the 1862 lighthouse sat right about out here where our measurements suggested it would. You can see how close it is. You can see that all of these buildings, not only the lighthouse, but the auxiliary building and the keeper's house, they all went to sea as well, right? They've all been eroded away. They're all gone. Even the barn. The barn no longer sits on land. One of the reasons we can't quite tell from the foundation stones is there are foundation stones out here. I'm confident from that earlier lighthouse. There are also foundation stones from this barn. There are even some foundation stones from later stuff like this that have eroded through the edge of the cliff. And they're all sandstone blocks. You can't tell the difference. So as evidence, we know we're in the right territory, but they're not very precise. I think this overlay of map and that earlier measurement gives us the best information we're going to get. We know that there's an interesting government letter that says, oh, well, let's let the barn go. We didn't use that barn much anyway. So when we move the lighthouse back to here, we're not going to give them another barn. We're just going to build them a small shed. So there's the small shed. And then this is the new lighthouse keeper, the lighthouse keeper's house that the government builds for them, putting it further back from the coastline so it would last longer. And in the meantime, the Bent family, who owned this property down here below, they were the lighthouse keeper's family. They built another barn for themselves and another house for themselves. Arthur Bent, John Bent, Arthur Bent, Percy Bent raised a family here. His son was the last of the lighthouse keepers. They lived here a long time. They farmed, they were lighthouse keepers, and they had plenty of time to set up a farm of their own with their own buildings, and that's what you're seeing underneath here. Didn't start that way in 1869, but it certainly turned that way as the decades unfolded. I think the most important thing I've learned from this, other than confirming locations, is we now have an even better idea of where those earlier coastlines were. This shows quite clearly a coastline that matches information we had from earlier. This shows the low water mark that we knew from earlier. And at the time of the lighthouse, the low water mark at that day had to have been even further out. In fact, we have a statement in one of these letters that it was another 100 feet out from there. So combining all of this information, trying to leave out the extraneous, but combining the important information, this is the panel we created in time for when we celebrated the lighthouse initially a year ago, as Dan said, on its 150th. And you can see how I've compiled this information here. Let me zoom in on this so you can see just a little better. And as my last slide, this will give me a chance of reviewing then what we found. We know now that the lighthouse from 1869 stood right out here, pretty close to this area, at a time when the coastline itself, the cliff edge, was closer to where that line was, and low water mark was way out here. Then low water mark moves in as erosion sets in. The coastline moves from there to here, threatening that lighthouse. So they move it up here. The coastline continues to erode until it threatens that lighthouse. So what we have here are a sequence of coastlines, cliff edges moving in, and low water marks moving in. Back to the lighthouse that was moved in 1911, the lighthouse that was moved in 1955, all of them pretty well on this original parcel of land. You can see that in 1955 they were to the edge of it. That's the point at which the government then bought an additional parcel of land so that the lighthouse would stay on it. And when we've moved the lighthouse now in 2016, we've stayed inside that parcel. We went about as far back inside that parcel as we could and landed it pretty well directly on where the pathway leading out to the lighthouse now is. So there are the 4 lighthouses. There are their earliest locations. And as they say, that's my story. And Dan and I are sticking to it. I would be delighted by any comments you may have or questions you might like to raise.